Island of the Giants, a small island in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, contains some of the biggest megalithic monuments. They form a major scientific enigma, which science has difficulty to explain. Perhaps it is because certain basic, but nevertheless key, observations have been bypassed. The three small islands of Malta, Gozo and Camino float in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, south of Sicily and east off the Tunisian coastline. Though small, their history dates back thousands of years, and continues to throw a magical spell on many visitors, and weaned to ask whether the modern tourists are the last in a series of sun worshippers that came to these islands. Various megalithic monuments are located on Malta, dated at approximately 4000 BC. What is important is that the buildings are unique in style and that their builders, as is so often the case, are unknown. Malta is by far the biggest of the three islands. It measures 40 kilometers in length and is 20 kilometers wide. The eastern part of the island is the megalithic monuments of Tarksin, Hagar Ki and Mnajdra. The most northern is Tarksin, a vast temple complex that has become surrounded by a modern town. Next to the old temple rises a modern church, as if underlining that what was once sacred, still is. The megalithic church consists out of a series of oval-shaped chapels, typical for the Maltese temple structure. The Temple of Tarksin is unique as it holds its own spring. Archaeological finds in the form of vessels suggest that water must have played an important role on this site, and it is more likely that the role of the spring and its water was spiritual, rather than economic. Better known is the subterranean chamber complex nearby. The famous Hypogeum, dating from the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. It is here that the remains of no less than 7,000 people were discovered. Archaeologists believe that both Mnajdra and the Hypogeum should be considered as one whole, but as the purpose they served, that remains an open question. Was the Hypogeum a temple of the dead, a cemetery? Certain finds inside do suggest that rituals were held inside the complex. The sites are located in the middle of a modern town, which makes it difficult to imagine the temples in a more original setting. But that setting can be perceived in the southern parts of Malta. On a slope near the coastline are the temples of Hagar Ki and Mnajdra. Both temples are close to each, a few hundred meters apart. Again, it suggests that both temples were part of one complex. When the complex is approached from the direction of Tarksin, the visitor finds himself in a valley that leads to the sea. It is there that the famous Blue Grotto can be found, an impressive display of nature that for modern tourists is still considered to be a must-see. It is perhaps this natural wonder that might explain the presence nearby off the temple complex, as it is located at a mere few hundred meters. Hagar Ki is the most impressive of all Maltese monuments. The finesse that was used to join the stones can be compared with the precision employed in the Valley Temple, next to the Sphinx, at Giza, Egypt, where the builders equally carved out massive stones and placed them together as if it was the easiest job in the world. But it is only the massive size of the stones that allows for such a comparison. Other than that, both sites have their own unique design and decoration. Still, as we know, that the Hagar Ki monument predates the Valley Temple with many centuries, could this Maltese knowledge of working with giant stones have made it into Egypt? The small island of Gozo also has a megalithic temple, Gauntia. The name is derived from local folklore, which says that only giants, gigantes, would have been able to construct such a complex. Its folklore is just a modern remain of the legendary importance the Greeks had instilled on the island. In Greek mythology, Gozo was the island where the nymph Calypso held Odysseus imprisoned for no less than 7 years. Her cave is situated near the temple, with the cave offering one of the most stunning view of the most famous sandy beach of the island. If Odysseus was indeed imprisoned here, the view from his prison window was excellent. The Temple of Gauntia contains, according to UNESCO, the largest freestanding stone in the world. In itself, this is not that impressive, as there are larger stones elsewhere, they are just not freestanding. Nevertheless, Gauntia is yet another impressive temple. What is very intriguing is that north of the temple itself, a stone circle can be found, showing that classic megalithic monuments were also constructed on the island. It is here that archaeologists, in 1987, uncovered human skeletons. The Zara stone circle furthermore has a subterranean complex of natural caves, which seem to have been used as a cemetery, thus apparently identifying this location as a Gozo counterpart of the Hypogeum on Malta's mainland. The presence of a temple connected with a subterranean cemetery seems to hint at rituals to do with the dead. Perhaps the temples, as was popular elsewhere, might also have been used by priests, employed to contact the ancestors. As there are no written traditions, at present, it is important to be more prudent and thus conclude that perhaps the temples and underground complexes were merely used for funerary rituals. The megalithic monuments no longer have a roof, but drawings that date from previous centuries and small models that were left by the megalithic builders themselves reveal that the temples once were roofed. If the roof was made from stone, then it is a major enigma where they disappeared to. Perhaps it is more like that other material was therefore used. Still, some archaeologists have concluded that stone would have been the preferred material for the roof, as such a roof would have been virtually impossible to build. They have concluded the temples never had a roof. Still, if we assume that the temples did have a roof, made of stone, then these structures would have closely resembled caves. Artificial caves, medito resemble the natural caves. Many temples are decorated with spirals, and the temples have oval-shaped chapels. Certain temples have 3 ovals, though most have 7. Most temples also contain statues, though most have been partially destroyed, either by the passing of time, or by a deliberate act of destruction at some point in the past. Some of the statues seem to be of a giant woman, with giant breasts, thighs and arms. Were they statues of the mother goddess? Many archaeologists believe this is indeed the case, though certainty should not be confused with belief in such cases. Though many archaeological discoveries have occurred in the last century, certain questions remain open. Who were the people that built these temples? Where did they come from? Apart from the temple, there are also the enigmatic cart ruts, which can be found in certain sections of the island. What purpose they served is unknown, but some speculate that they may have been markings in the rocky surface which would allow cows or bulls to follow the grooves, guided, as it were, by a mechanism that connected them to the ruts. This theory has become a hot topic of debate, even though near one car rut, a wheel, made from lava stone, was discovered. Perhaps they had an astronomical purpose, but if so, it is highly improbable that this can ever be proven. At present, the most likely possibility is that they will remain a mystery, though a major discovery seems to be made approximately every decade, so one will never know. Malta is an island. The closest land, Sicily, is invisible from its shores. Was Malta on par with Crete, as a site of a very ancient culture? There are certain parallels between the two islands. First of all, though both islands have their unique style, the general layout is largely identical. The presence of temples is in the eastern section of the island, close to the sea, and mostly in the northern and southern part of that eastern section. They are, furthermore, temples, buildings. At the same time, they are separated by 2,000 years. But as on Crete, it is clear that there is an interrelationship with caves and temple complexes, though the caves of Malta could never be found at the altitudes that some of the Cretan mountains rise to. Finally, some of the artifacts recovered from the sites are identical to artifacts recovered at e.g. Knos's, specifical lithe vessel. Though such comparisons can be made, it does not explain why Malta was chosen, and not Sicily. Certain demographic conditions might have already existed so many millennia ago that did not allow these people to build there, but perhaps there is a reason why Malta was specifically chosen. Malta has a unique climate, an incredible amount of sunshine, a statistic it shares with e.g. Carnac in France, where Othermajor monuments are found. Furthermore, the Carnac structures were constructed at roughly the same time as the monuments of Malta. Were the people of Malta solar worshippers? The possibility that the religion of the Maltese temple builders was in worship seems likely, particularly when certain information, identified by Joseph Eliul, is taken into account. Eliul's father was the caretaker of the Hagar Ki complex, a privileged position to learn much about the complex and be confronted with a wide variety of visitors, each giving their insights. As a result, Eliul was able to identify that certain chapels of the complex were carefully orientated towards the sunrise and sunset off to equinoxes and solstices, e.g. December 21st and June 21st. The moon was also an important phenomenon, specifically its 19-year metonic period. Certain doors frame the full moon at the start of this cycle, which also shows that the planning of these complexes must have taken many decades. Perhaps it is indeed the fact that Malta is an island which has set it apart by the temple builders. Many ancient religions speak of an island, where the sun god had created the world. In Egypt, this was the god Atum, who masturbated the world in existence. In the French town of Carnac, we find an artificial hill, on top of which can be found specifically phallic-like standing stones. We note that the mother goddess statues of Malta might perhaps be more displays of fertility, and hence creation, pregnancy, when breasts become larger than they normally are. The Maltese builders did not leave us any written documents. The quest for the final answer continues. But it is clear that Malta is no longer the enigma that it once was. It has certain unique characteristics, but also some features that can be found elsewhere. If the voices of the old giants could speak, an island near the coastline of the Hagar Ki, does it feature in the legends of an island of creation? Malta temples and tombs. The Hypogeum, which I was able to visit in 1989, is now closed for conservation since 1992 and is still closed. Could it have something to do with the following story? Just beneath the southern tip of Italy, in the extreme western part of the Mediterranean Sea, lies the island of Malta. In the past, Malta has been the possession of many nationalities, and has been considered to be one of the most strategic areas on Earth, being a port and an intersecting point between Europe, Asia, the Middle East, and Africa, etc. This 9-mile-long island was an ancient center of civilization at the time when the Phoenicians from Carthage invaded and began to rule it. When a group of ancient priests who worshipped the god, Moloch, another name for Baal, Osiris, or Nimrod, considered by the ancients to be the sun god, visited the island in Old Testament times, the islanders readily accepted their teachings, including that of offering up human sacrifices to appease their god, Moloch, for the ancient Maltese themselves practiced human blood sacrifice to the gods of the underworld, which were believed to exist beneath the island and elsewhere, so-called deities which were often identified with serpents. When the Apostle Paul visited the island, as recorded in the book of Acts chapter 28, he learned of their superstitious beliefs concerning serpents after he had been bitten by one of the beasts on the island, at the time called Melita, and survived by the power of the risen Jesus, a god which the Maltese knew nothing about until Paul's fateful visit. Since the time of the Carthaginians, Malta has had many rulers: Romans, Arabs, Normans, Aragonese, Castilians. The Hospitallers are the order of St. John of Jerusalem, later known as the Knights of Rhodes, and still later as the Knights of Malta, who remain there to this day, having dual headquarters in Rome. A few miles south of the town of Valletta, Malta, is the small village of Casal Pala. In the year 1902, workmen who were digging a well literally fell into the earth. What they discovered, or rather rediscovered, was a series of ancient caves, mostly excavated out of solid rock, which descended into the earth and into 3 lower levels below. These multi-leveled catacombs became known as the Hypogeum of Hal Safleni, named after the street beneath which they were discovered. A hypogeum is the Latin name for an underground structure. Near the floor of the last chamber, within the third and last, officially recognized, sub-level of these ancient catacombs, there are a few so-called burial chambers. These are only a few feet square and situated right next to the floor, and one must get on their knees just to look into them. These burial chambers are just large enough for one to crawl through. There have for years been rumors that one of these burial chambers does not end, but continues into deeper and unexplored caverns beyond. This, according to certain sources, was the subterranean passage and chamber which was referred to years ago in an article which appeared in the August 1940 issue of the National Geographic magazine. The article stated the following concerning several people who disappeared in these catacombs without a trace. Many subterranean passageways, including ancient catacombs, now are a part of the island's fortifications and defense system. Supplies are kept in many tunnels, others are bomb shelters. Beneath Valletta, some of the underground areas surveyed as homes for the poor. Prehistoric men built temples and chambers in these vaults. In a pit beside one sacrificial altar lie thousands of human skeletons. Years ago, one could walk underground from one end of Malta to the other. The government closed the entrances to these tunnels after school children and their teachers became lost in the labyrinth while on a study tour and never returned. The story goes much deeper, however, than the National Geographic article indicates. Other sources say that about 30 children vanished in these catacombs on the study tour, and that when the Hypogeum was first discovered, nearly 30,000 human skeletons of men, women and children, victims of ancient sacrifice to the underworld gods, performed by an old Neolithic race, were discovered as well. One article written by a Miss Lois Jessup, at the time an employee of the British Embassy and later secretary for the New York Saucer Information Bureau, better known as NYSIB, appeared in an old issue of Riley Crabb's Borderland Science magazine, published by the Borderland Sciences Research Foundation, BSRF, and was later reprinted in full in Dr. Allen book Enigma Fantastique. Miss Jessup claimed that she visited Malta and the Hypogeum also, once before the tragic disappearance of the children, and shortly thereafter. She described how on her first visit to the catacombs she finally convinced the guide to allow her to investigate one of the so-called burial chambers, near the floor of the last chamber in the third sub-basement, the supposed end of the Hypogeum tour. He seemed to know something she didn't, but finally consented and told her that she could enter at her own risk. As she did so, candle in hand and her loosed sash being used as a guide rope for her friends who followed behind, she crawled through the small passage and eventually emerged into a large cavern, where she found herself on a ledge overlooking a very deep, seemingly bottomless chasm. Below and on the other side of the chasm was another ledge which appeared to lead to a doorway or tunnel in the far wall. We realize that what happened next might sound unbelievable to many who read this, but we would ask them to make their own determination of its validity. Miss Jessup swears that what follows really happened. Out of this lower tunnel on the far side of the chasm, she claims, emerged in single-file several large creatures of humanoid form but completely covered with hair from head to foot. Noticing her, they raised their arms in her direction, palms out, at which point a violent wind began to blow through the cavern, snuffing out her candle. Then, something, wet and slippery, apparently a creature of a different sort, brushed past her. This all happened just as the person behind her was beginning to emerge from the passage and into the cavern. They could not understand her panicked attempts to get back to the Hypogeum room, but they consented after she insisted. When they found themselves back in the Hypogeum chamber, the guide saw her expression and gave her a knowing look. About a week afterwards, the disappearance of the children and their teachers took place, and on her second visit she saw an entirely new guide who denied that the other guide had ever worked there, although she knew that this new guide was hiding something. She learned from more cooperative sources, however, that this was the tunnel that the children and their teachers and possibly the old guide had entered. She also learned that after the last child had made it through, the walls of the small tunnel just happened to collapse or cave in. Although the official version stated that the walls caved in on the students, search parties were never able to locate any trace of the teachers or the children, although the rope that they had used to fasten themselves to the lower Hypogeum chamber was found to have been clean-cut as if by something sharp, not falling rock. It was asserted that for weeks afterwards the wailing and screaming of children was heard underground in different parts of the island, but no one could locate the sources of the cries. As for the catacombs beneath Malta itself, there are some ancient accounts which say that deep caverns beneath the island continue underground beyond the shores, and according to one source, i.e. the ever-elusive Commander X, part of this labyrinth stretches hundreds of miles northwards and intersects with catacombs beneath Rome, the Hill Vaticanus, or at least did so in ancient times. Malta. The skulls of the Mother Goddess. In the megalithic temple of Hal Saflieni, in Malta, men with extraordinary cranial volume were buried. These skulls seem to belong to a strange human stock and if properly analyzed, could create an ideal link between the ancient Mesopotamian and Egyptian cultures and a race of sacerdotal men identified with the snake. We are back from a visit in Malta among the suite of Maurizia Giusti, alias Sia Blady, and the crew of her Italian national TV show, Tourists by Chance. Together, we followed the traces of an ancient story that originated from the presence of megalithic temples dedicated to the Mother Goddess on the island, a thaumaturgic figure, adored in prehistorical times of this island that was to become an important cult center. The coverage gave us the possibility to try to resolve a mystery of interesting implications. It was known that until 1985 a number of skulls, found in prehistoric Maltese temples at Tarksin, Baganga and Hal Saflieni, were exposed in the Archaeological Museum of the Valletta. But since a few years ago, these were removed and placed in the deposits. From then, they were not to be seen by the public. Only the photographs taken by the Maltese researcher Dr. Anton Mifsud and his colleague, Dr. Charles Savona Ventura, remain to testify the existence of the skulls and prove their abnormality. Books written by the two Maltese doctors, who since our first day in Malta helpfully provided us the necessary documentation for our research, illustrate a collection of skulls that show peculiar abnormalities and/or pathologies. Sometimes inexistent cranial knitting lines, abnormally developed temporal partitions, drilled and swollen occiputs as following recovered traumas, but above all, a strange, lengthened skull, bigger and more peculiar than the others, lacking of the median knitting. The presence of this finding leads to a number of possible hypotheses. The similitude with other similar skulls, from Egypt to South America, the particular deformity, unique in the panorama of medical pathology referred to such distant times, we are talking about approximately 3000 BC, could be an exceptional discovery. Was that skull a result of ancient genetic mutation between different races that lived on that island? The dolichocephalous skulls, a request to the museum's management by the show's producers to see and film the exhibits, would have certainly failed if it weren't for the intercession of the Minister of Tourism, Michael Refalo, whom we met at the end of a press conference hosted by Maurizia Giusti, and of course, us of Hera, organized by Dr. Robert Zammit, of the Maltese Provincial Tourism Board. The minister, whose interest in the matter we enhanced, accompanied us personally to the nearby museum, snatching the director's permission to bring out those mysterious craniums, conserved far from the sight of curious onlookers André searchers since about 15 years. A couple of days later, in fact, guided by the museum's authorities, we were received in a reserved area, closed to public, where the extraordinary exhibits were brought, before our eyes, under the supervision and gentle accessibility of the museum's archaeologist, Mark Anthony Mifsud, almost homonymous of the previous researcher. The skulls were all found in the Hal Saflanti Hypogeum, where a sacred well was dedicated to the mother goddess and where also the small statue of a sleeping goddess was found, associated to a relic with a snake inscription on it. The skulls were burrowed out of their box one at a time. Among these, all very interesting, was the one we were looking for. The cranium showed a very pronounced dolichocephalus, in other words, a lengthened posterior part of the skullcap, besides the lack of median knitting, technically named sagitta. This last detail has been considered impossible by medics and anatomists to whom we turned, not having, as far as known, analogous pathological cases in international medical literature. It is a characteristic that emphasizes the anomaly of this finding, with the result of producing a natural lengthening of the cranium in the occipital area, not due to bandaging or boards used in pre-Columbian civilizations. We believe that the discovery of this skull and the like at Hal Saflanti isn't accidental. The priests of the goddess, Malta and Gozo, were very important centers since prehistoric times, places where medical cures were conducted, oracles and ritual encounters with the priests of the goddess. There, on both the islands, existed many sanctuaries and thaumaturgic centers, where priests surrounded the healing goddess, direct expression of her divinity. It is well known that, in antiquity, the serpent was associated to the goddess and toe-healing capacities. The snake also belongs to the subterranean world. Therefore, a hypogeum dedicated to the goddess and the water cult was the right place for a sacerdotal group that was defined, in all the most ancient cultures, as the serpent priests. Perhaps the skulls found in the hypogeum and examined during our visit to Malta belonged indeed to these priests. As mentioned before, they present an accentuated dolichocephalus, which is particularly the center of our analysis. The long head and drawn features must have given a serpent-like appearance, stretching the eyes and skin. Lacking the lower part of the exhibit, we can only speculate, but the hypothesis can't be far from reality, a reality worsened by the fact that such deformities certainly created walking problems, forcing him to slither. The lack of the cranium's median knitting and therefore, the impossibility of the brain's consistent, radial expansion in the skullcap, did so that it developed in the occipital zone of the cerebellum, deforming the cranium that looked like a single cap from the frontal and occipital area. This must have certainly caused the man terrible agony since infancy, but probably enhanced visions that were considered as being proof of a bond with the goddess. Another race, even the other skulls we examined presented strange anomalies. Some were more natural and harmonic than the cranium that mostly gained our attention, but they still presented a pronounced natural dolichocephalus, and we could assume, without fear of refutation, that it is distinctive of an actual race, different to the native populations of Malta and Gozo. This consideration was confirmed by the Maltese archaeologists themselves, Anthony Buonanno and Mark Anthony Mifsud, who said, they are another race although C14 or DNA exams haven't yet been performed. Perhaps these individuals originated from Sicily. We shall discuss this detail further on. Meanwhile, it's worth the while to emphasize that one of these skulls showed unequivocal signs of surgical intervention in the occipital area. The outlines of 3 small holes, made in the occipital bone called inion, had time to cicatrize, therefore the patient survived the operation, although such intervention surely would have undermined his motorial faculties. But there is more. A fair part off to 7,000 skeletons dug out of the Hal Saflanti Hypogeum and examined by Themistocles Zammit in 1921, present artificially performed deformations. A skeleton of the group that was unburied by the archaeologist, Brocktorff Circle, shows clear signs of intentional deformation through bondage. The say deformations occurred for various reasons: initiations, matrimonies, solar rituals or punishments for social crimes or transgressions. All the tribal apparatus of incisions, perforations, partial or total removals, cauterizations, abrasions, insertions of extraneous bodies in muscles, like the modification of bodies for magical, medical or cosmetic purposes, were part of cruel practices in such, but with best intentions for the community. Why such persistence in tormenting one's own body? Was there any connection between the tribal rituals and themen of the lengthened cranium? Could it be possible that, as in other cultures, successive populations tended to deform their infants' heads in order to make them similar to this race of serpent priests in Malta? All this was practiced by a mysterious populace that erected gigantic temples to the mother goddess between 4100 and 2500 BC. The presence of these skulls might be that of the last exponents of the most ancient sacerdotal caste that built the megalithic temples and, never having blended with the local populations, had continued reproducing through the millenniums within familiar unions, as was the usual practice among the elite, and consequently impoverished its genetic patrimony until inevitable pathologies manifested, finally disappearing. The origins The skulls we examined are dated 2500 BC, but maybe even older, a date in which Malta's megalithic history ends, initiating a period of historical darkness and absence of population that will last about 300 years, until the arrival of the Phoenicians. These will begin to make Malta their Mediterranean outpost. The Phoenicians will also erect temples to the mother goddess in Malta, calling her Astarte, the snake-faced goddess. Again we find the representation of a goddess who is associated with the snake and healing powers, almost as if the Phoenicians wanted to continue an interrupted tradition. But it's the date of 2500 BC that presents a fundamental key of interpretation for understanding who these long-headed individuals were, and to use it we must move from Malta to nearby Egypt. Professor Walter B. Emery, 1903–1971, the famous Egyptologist, author of Archaic Egypt, who excavated at Saqqara in the 30s, indeed discovered the remains of individuals who lived in pre-dynastic epoch. These presented a dolichocephalous skull, larger than that of the local ethnic group, fair hair and a taller, heavier build. Emery declared that this stock wasn't indigenous to Egypt but had performed an important sacerdotal and governmental role in this country. This race kept its distance from the common people, blending only with the aristocratic classes, and the scholar associated them with the Shemsu Hor, the disciples of Horus. The Shemsu Hor are recognized as the dominant sacerdotal caste in pre-dynastic Egypt, until approximately 3000 BC, being mentioned in the Turin Papyrus and the list of the kings of Abydos. It's interesting to note that Emery writes, towards the end of the IV millennium BC, the people known as the disciples of Horus appear as a highly dominant aristocracy that governed entire Egypt. The theory of the existence of this race is supported by the discovery in the pre-dynastic tombs in the northern part of Higher Egypt, of the anatomical remains of individuals with bigger skulls and builds than the native population, with so much difference to exclude any hypothetical common racial strain. The fusion of the two races must have come about in ages that concurred, more or less, with the unification of the two Egyptian kingdoms. Therefore, what occurred in Malta is also reflected in Egypt. It's noticeable that in Lower Egypt, the pharaoh's symbol is a bee named bit. It isn't coincidental that Malta's ancient name is Melita, which derives from the Latin word for honey. Malta's symbol was also a bee and its hexagonal cells. Melita has its origin in mel, or myrrh, that in ancient Egypt was the name attributed to the pyramids. Besides, the English term, honey, is strictly related to the original name of Heliopolis, which is, on. It is an interesting correlation that in Egypt, the Shemsu Hor guaranteed the respect of a solar religion, and even today in Malta the sun is called Shem-Shi. Shem is a word of Akkadic origin, not Egyptian, deriving from the Babylonian term for the sun, that is, Shamash. This proves that the Shemsu Hor came from the fertile half-moon area. An umpteenth correlation is the fact that this sacerdotal long-skulled caste disappeared in Egypt, as in Malta in the same period, which is between 3000 and 2500 BC. Who writes is convinced, although, that a third nucleus was present in the Euphrates zone, becoming part of the Aryan stock known as Mithans, who the Egyptians called Naharan, those of the snake, from Nahash, snake. The Mithans, who occupied a part of the Kurdistan area, were Abraham's people, whose description is analogous to that of the Shemsu Hor made by Emery, fair hair and robust build. The serpent priest tradition originates in the Middle East, with its foremost center right in Kurdistan, where at about 5000 BC the matriarchal culture of Jarma represented the mother goddesses as divinities with faces of vipers and lengthened heads. These divinities will successively be associated to the fallen angels, or Nephilims, that are most explicitly cited in the Testament of Amran, in the Qumran scrolls, in which is written, one of them was of terrifying aspect, like a snake, and his mantle was multicolored, and also, his face was that of a viper, and he wore all his eyes. It concerns, in our opinion, not divinities in the strict sense, but individuals in sacerdotal or shaman expression, belonging to a highly developed and profoundly wise culture that had relationships with lesser organized societies of the period. Its members were considered as half-gods, for the knowledge they possessed, just like in Egypt with the Shemsu Hor. Analogous viper-faced statues of mother goddesses are found in the land of the Nile, dating back exactly from the archaic period of the Shemsu Hor. It can be therefore concluded that these serpent priests were the most ancient race that first occupied the fertile half-moon area, particularly Anatolia and Kurdistan, and Egypt, following migrations dating back 6000–4000 BC, until reaching Malta to disappear around 2500 BC. But this culture survived in the Middle East and probably included one of the most famous and mysterious pharaohs of Egypt. It concerns the Mithans and the pharaoh Akhenaten. The reason why Akhenaten was linked to the Mithans will be the subject of a following article, but the way he was portrayed in his statues and bas-reliefs, and with him, the whole royal family, is indeed that of an individual of lengthened head and human face but with serpent likeness, characteristics found in the pre-dynastic Egyptian stock mentioned by Emery, besides being the exact representation of the features of the Nephilims and probably the long-skulled individuals of Malta. The craniums of the Amarnian dynasty statues and the Malta craniums result as being practically identical, a not-so-fortuitous fact, also proved by the X-rays of Tutankhamun's skull, Akhenaten's son, which showed a dolichocephalous cranium. Substantially, the Maltese craniums are the relics, archaeologically still not understood, of a sacerdotal race that, in Egypt and Malta, from archaic ages, survived till 2500 BC. It's the group that created the religious and spiritual substrata that characterized the greatest civilizations of the Old World, from long ago, 600 BC, or even earlier. This group continued in the Middle East and somehow returned in Egypt around 1351 BC, giving birth, through the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, to a religious reform that aimed to restore the ancient order. And if the hypothesis that this pharaoh was linked some way to the figure of Moses is accepted, then the rest is history. Atlantis in Malta. Malta is a platform, an elevation of the seafloor that has showed its want to immerse more than once. 35 prehistoric temples distributed on the two major islands, Malta and Gozo, and many others actually submerged by the sea, make one think of a catastrophe that must have happened here around 3000–2500 BC, something that left its sign. Steep reefs falling vertically to the sea, contrarily to the more sloping northern shore, form the southern coast of Malta, the Dingley Cliffs. It's as if the island's major axis rotated around itself, submerging most of the coast that faces Sicily. Some local archaeologists, including the already mentioned Dr. Anton Mifsud and Dr. Charles Savona Ventura, consider this cataclysm to be the real cause of the Atlantis legend's birth, the history of which would re-emerge from a number of relics off the island's mysterious megalithic past. The population that created extraordinary structures of giant stones, at a certain point of the island's history, just disappeared. 250 years of darkness actually characterize the story of these people until the arrival of the new populations that successively occupied Malta. What had determined such an immense catastrophe? Perhaps an earthquake or the subsiding of the calcareous platform on which Malta stands. However, we know from the Leningrad Papyrus, a hieratic scroll dated 1115 BC conserved at the Hermitage Museum, an Egyptian document composed around 2000 BC, dating back to the 12th dynasty, that a serpent populace was destroyed by a star falling from the heavens. Only one survived on an island, destined to be completely submerged. What is this strange fable? Was it the record of a catastrophe that destroyed a particular Mediterranean region? The myth also connected the serpents to the figures of mother goddesses such as Tanit, Inanna, Isis and Eve. They are feminine divinities that carry the baton of a culture to which the snake brings wisdom, medical, scientific and esoteric knowledge. But a doubt arises. Couldn't these serpents rather be human beings of strange physical form, perhaps even a handicap? Mythology is full of weird beings that often seem more likely clinical cases than true divinities. For example, Cecrops, the mythical founder and first king of Athens, according to tradition, was born from the soil and his appearance was half human and half serpent. According to others, he came to Attica from Egypt and built the Acropolis, diffusing the cult of Zeus and Athena. Pythia, or Python, was a priestess of Delphi, taken by Apollo, who pronounced oracles. She took her name from Python the snake, killed by Apollo and believed to be buried under her temple. The woman enunciated the verdicts sitting on a sacred tripod seat in the mouth of a natural gorge, from which vapors exhaled and communicated them to an assistant priest, said prophet, whom in turn transmitted them to the postulant. But let's go back to Malta. Even St. Paul shipwrecked in the Maltese bay that still bears his name, dealing with a snake that bit his foot. In reality, in the days of St. Paul, the 1st century AD, these animals didn't exist in Malta. So it's strange that such a reptile bit indeed this holy man. This legend may well be interpreted in a different, simpler manner. The serpent was the last priest of the great goddess left on the island, whose thaumaturgic power was threatened by that of Paul, obliged to dismantle what was left of the last pagan bastion of the great healing goddess.